Hey everybody, it's your friend Adam. I'm here to talk to Karl. Karl has been on. We've got some background noise going for you, Karl. Can you mute yourself for a second?
Okay.
I'm thinking that's on your end. So I'm here. I'm here with Karl. Karl did a live stream that I watched. It was super interesting. He's in Paul Vanderklay's comments all the time, and this guy leaves the best comments. I was kind of jealous that he wasn't commenting on my videos, but he's over at my channel now commenting away. So you guys might see him in the comment section. He's a super smart guy. He wants to give me some feedback on Jonathan Haidt, which I'm always looking for people that are a little bit skeptical of Jonathan Haidt's moral foundations theory. So we're going to talk a bit about that. I'm going to do something very uncharacteristic of Adam that I need to do more often. I have a couple of projects that I'm working on, and one of the reasons why I do so much YouTube is because I want to do successful projects. I have a project that is of my actual artwork. I'm a painter here in Los Angeles, so I'm going to be crowdfunding a book on that. My collectors have been wanting me to do it for years and years and years. I've just been doing other things. So I'm working on putting together a 100-page book of my paintings. If you're interested in a signed copy of that, I'll probably be launching that soon. That is really kind of a test because the big project that I'm working on is a graphic novel based on a screenplay that I wrote. The screenplay got some interest here in Los Angeles. Producers were calling it Zombieland meets Train Spotting. It's about a bunch of derelict, backsliding drug addicts that save the world from a mutant apocalypse. So it's very crazy. I am collaborating with another artist on it. We're both working on the book. That we are planning on crowdfunding in February. So if you're interested in that, stay tuned. You can also subscribe to my second channel. I put it up on the screen. It's youtube.com/friended. I upload artist videos there, performance art videos. I have a great video that's coming out soon. That is another fire video. That's just, I mean, it's off the chain. You guys are gonna freak out when you see this video. I filmed this thing I blew up like with four different cameras, and literally a fireball engulfed one of the cameras. So it's pretty crazy. So, Karl, do you want to do an introduction or anything? Do you want to say anything? You're still muted, so you need to unmute yourself, Karl. Karl, you're still muted. Yeah.
Correct.
Thanks for
All right,
muting.
that's better. So you don't have the feedback anymore, right?
No,
Okay.
no, no. So what? So thanks for
All
that.
right. Yeah. So yeah. Well, briefly, just a word on how I came to be on your channel. I mean, I'm a big fan of the Paul Vanderklay channel, which I'm sure a lot of your viewers and listeners are familiar with. At least you've done at least a couple of videos with him, right?
Yes,
And
three now.
I came to him from my interest in Jordan Peterson. But my interest in, in general, in philosophy and evolutionary psychology, all kinds of other subjects, physics, my background, my formal educational background is in the hard sciences. But I've had that interest since I was in high school, basically, and it's never left me, even throughout my entire career, even though I did not have an academic career. Quite different. I was in the U.S. Air Force, being a fighter pilot for a long time, and basically being a defense contractor. But as a personal interest, these ideas have always intrigued me, and I've tried to get myself to think about them rationally and try to figure out how the world really works, I guess. But yeah, Jordan Peterson was kind of talking my language, and then Paul Vanderklay also, even though he's coming at it from a much more directly religious perspective, him being a Calvinist pastor, also was saying a lot of things that made sense to me. So I'm sure they did to you, and that's why you ended up talking to him. But that's where I come from, and it turned out watching your channel that I think you and I are pretty much aligned on a lot of things, in the sense that I consider myself, I don't use the word atheist like you do, but we can talk about the reasons for that. So I use agnostic, and I don't want to get into a whole debate into the pros and cons of that. But essentially, my perspective is from an evolutionary point of view, which again I think meshes right with where you're coming from.
Very much.
And I'm not an anti-theist, just like what, that's the term you use. So I do see the benefit, as well as some of the potential dangers, of course, of religion. But I don't think it's all black and white as some people would have it. So.
Yes, definitely. So you in our emails, you wanted to talk a little bit about objective morality. So I think you're following my debate on objective morality, and I guess I'm really trying to establish this kind of middle position. I think we might still be getting some feedback as I'm talking. Do you have headphones, Karl? Just out of curiosity.
Yeah, I can put headphones in if you're getting feedback. I haven't had this problem before, but it's possible. Let me put some headphones on.
I have a very deep voice that resonates in rooms.
Maybe.
So, there we go.
Is that
much
better?
Much better.
Okay, well there you go. We solved the problem.
So we had talked a bit about objective morality. I guess you're following my conversation on objective morality as I'm trying to kind of forge this middle position. The theists have this objective morality claim that they're like, without God, we can't establish any kind of objective morality. So they want to base morality objectively in God. And I keep saying, well, you're using God as an enforcement mechanism, but you're still going to have the same debate over what God's intentions are, what God wants. That's still going to be difficult.
And, that's
go ahead.
That's the old Euthyphro argument, as far as I'm concerned, from Plato's dialogue Euthyphro, which is nothing new. Does God's law, are his laws because they are good in the first place from an independent perspective, or does the fact that God makes those laws make them good in and of themselves? Right. So it's kind of like if God's word is the good automatically, by definition, that's completely arbitrary.
Right.
If, on the other hand, God wants the good because it's good based on some kind of other external objective criteria, then we don't necessarily need to have God to explain. We can just search for those objective criteria ourselves and figure them out.
Yeah, and
which is where I'm coming from.
And me too. So do you have you said in your email that you wanted to talk a bit about objective morality. Do you have a critique of this position that I'm basically trying to forge?
Well, no, not your critique. I'm not going to. I have seen several of your videos on this, but you've done many more than that I have not seen. I'm trying to catch up with your videos, but I do have a critique of specifically Jonathan Haidt's perspective on this, which is a pretty, hardcore intuitionism, which I don't really agree with. I mean, I do think intuition is very important, of course, but I do think he underestimates the role that reason plays in our search for moral values. So my take is we humans discover human morality as we go along, right? Mm-hmm. And I think you've put a lot of emphasis on the evolutionary part of that, which is, groups with better morals tend to survive longer than the ones with with lesser values, I guess. Yeah, am I correct in stating that? Is that a fair assessment of your perspective? And I think there's a lot to that, but I think it's not the whole story, though.
Okay.
I do think, first of all, it's a little bit dangerous, or you have to be very careful, let's put it this way, when you say that, well, we observe, certain groups have survived longer than others, and therefore that shows, maybe it proves, or at least it's an indication that their moral values are better than other groups. But part of that depends at what time you make your observation, right? So, and there were a lot of times, for example, I mean, slavery was pretty much a universal institution throughout the world until pretty recently, in human history, historical terms. Basically, it only disappeared, well, actually worldwide, it only disappeared officially in the 1960s, I say, not 1860s, but 1960s in the Middle East. I can't remember if it was Saudi Arabia or one of the other Middle Eastern countries, still had legal slavery until the 1960s. But let's say, even if we discount that, and let's say that, slavery became disreputable and no longer legal, mostly in the 19th century, that's very recent. So if you are an observer back, let's say in the 18th century, you might have deducted that, well, slavery is actually a moral good because most societies are using it and they seem to be doing okay, right? So yeah, that's why I'm saying you have to be pretty careful. So to me, the fact that a group has been relatively successful using certain values, whether they're moral values, and moral values does not exhaust the sum total of all values. We have a bunch of different values at different levels, and we can put moral values at the top. But that's a clue or an indication that there might be something there, but I don't think you can just stop there. I think you have to look deeper into it, and one of the main tools we have to look into it is reason. So, and that becomes more and more prevalent as we learn more from the sciences about things like game theory, complexity theory, emergence, and evolutionary psychology. I mean, all these things are potential contributors to us gaining a better understanding of what makes for good moral values and moral rules. So would you say that's a fair assessment?
Yeah, so you've made several points. We're talking about intuitionism. We're talking about slavery being considered moral at one time and being considered immoral now. And there's also you're saying that reason plays a strong role, which I agree with you. I'll make a point about that. But let's start with the slavery thing. I think we agree that we're discovering better moral systems as we progress through time. But there's generally a risk to trying new things. Like maybe those new things work out, maybe they don't. I would even argue that a lot of the gender stuff that the left is playing with now is an attempt at something new and novel that may work out or may not work out. I mean, my gut intuitions tell me it's a dead end. It's an evolutionary dead end for a lot of obvious reasons. But even in biological evolution, the new things evolution tries are always by accident. They're mutations. So even culturally, we can have these things that are mutations that are purely random. Someone comes up with a crazy idea that what if we don't have any genders? And then a society forms around that idea, and that society either does better or worse. But the conservative side of the equation is always conscious of the fact that there are risks. And that is the same intuition that they had during slavery. They were saying, there's a risk if we're going to abolish this institution, there's a risk that we will lose some of what we've gained culturally. Now, once they did that, they obviously it was a huge gain, I would argue, and I think that we have plenty of evolutionary arguments why it was a huge gain. So the reason why something is going to be successful is not always right at hand, but I think more if we dive into this evolutionary argument for morality, I think more and more we will be able to look in the future and say, well, we know enough about what might happen that we can say, this will probably go in this direction. And even, I've read books where they taught, there was this great book about called Political Tribes. I can't remember the author, but she had talked. Have you read that book? That book is really good.
No, but I've heard about it.
So okay, she brings an evolutionary psychology argument to the Bush administration about what is going to happen in Iraq if we invade Iraq and give them democracy, because she basically says in a lot of these nations there are these majorities that are being held down by minorities, and as soon as you give the vote, you give the power to the majority, and the majority is going to use that power for retribution. That's exactly what's going to happen, which is like a standard evolutionary argument. So we knew ahead of time what was going to happen in Iraq, but just no one was willing to listen. Everyone in the Bush administration was going by their own intuitions and not listening to this argument.
Right.
So I think there are a lot of times that people are able to use what we're learning in evolution and morality to basically predict the future. Whether or not people take that advice, well, the more people are proven right by time, the more people I think will be willing to take that advice. But obviously, it's situation by situation. So that is my tip on slavery. You want to rebut on that before I move on?
No, I think overall, nothing that you said is objectionable. It's right. But there were people, even back in ancient Greece, that were making rational arguments against slavery.
Mm-hmm.
And so you could say, well, see, they didn't have any impact because slavery lasted 2,000 years after that, and then some. And so, but I think now you can make, as a matter of fact, it was interesting something that you said early on before, in your talk. You said, well, I have this intuition for certain reasons. Understand, having an intuition for certain reasons is kind of an interesting turn of phrase, right? That means your intuition is at least supposedly based on some kind of, maybe not conscious.
That's interesting.
But some kind, no, it is interesting, right? And yeah. I think people are like this. There's an interesting book that I read several years ago that's not very, not a well-known author. But it's called The Myth of the Closed Mind by, I think it's Ray Scott Percival. Mm-hmm. And it's not a widely read book, but it kind of has the opposite argument of what Jonathan Haidt says, right? I think the truth part is in between. But he says people can't help, even with all their tendencies to think emotionally and to intuit and have everybody has their opinion, and is entitled to your opinion. He says deep down, if you really dig really deep, most people most of the time really want to be thought of as rational, right? So even if they can't express the reasons that they believe something, deep down they want to believe that they do have reasons for believing that. So does that make sense?
Yeah, it totally does. It's funny.
Right.
I have a question for you
sorry.
on the reason thing. So we're really talking about reason versus intuition. I think both are useful, but don't both need to be tested empirically to find, like, reason can be wrong and intuition can both be wrong, correct?
Right. But in both cases, what are you going to use to test them empirically, though? You're going to use reason. You're going to use the law of non-contradiction. In other words, and I completely agree, intuition is absolutely essential, as a matter of fact, for to produce novelty in the world. But the problem is when you basically come to the point of saying that just because I intuit something, that's automatically more true than something else. You do have to test it against evidence and the world and facts and evidence. So and that's true with things that you can deduce from reason too. You have to push things until you get to the point where there is a contradiction. Now, if you deal with people who can accept that both A and non-A can be true at the same time, you're done with reason at that point, right? You're done. I mean, there's nothing else you can do. And some people are like that. They can hold two completely opposite ideas and it doesn't bother them at all. Something can be both blue and red at the same time. And yeah, that's the way it is. So, but I think most people do have a sense of contradiction, whether it's a contradiction of, facts with ideas or just ideas with ideas. So it's like solving a Sudoku puzzle or something like that, or a crossword puzzle, and you keep putting numbers in a Sudoku grid, until you find out, oh, wait a second, I missed something. There's a contradiction because I've got two of the same numbers in the same row or column or something. At that point, you know, you do realize that you made a mistake. If you're sane and you know, and rational, obviously, you know, it's somebody can just keep doing the puzzle and just accept that, okay, there's like 2 or 3 different numbers in the same column, and I can live with it, no big deal. But most people at that point say, okay, you know, I got to go back and retrace my steps and start over again with a better idea, right? I made a mistake somewhere. So that's my analogy.
Yeah, you bring up an interesting thing, and I want to drill in on this because maybe you can give me some feedback, because you're the non-contradiction thing, is that a priority position in logic and reason? Is that, I don't know much about formal logic and reason.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Well, maybe I assumed a little bit more than I should have.
No, let me give you some feedback before you respond, because I want to say, you know, there's this thing called the consistency principle in human beings, where we want to be consistent, and it's an evolutionary advantage to be consistent, because you signal that you're trustworthy, and people are looking for trustworthy cooperation partners. So people are more interested in being consistent, even in situations where they shouldn't be consistent. Like the sunk cost fallacy is out of the consistency principle. You know, if you've lost a bunch of money gambling, you always feel like, well, I'm right on the verge of winning, even though you're not any closer to winning anything, right? So at that point, the thing to do is to be inconsistent, to abandon the strategy that's not working and follow a different strategy. So in certain realms, I'm skeptical of being consistent. I know that there's a difference between a contradiction, but also I have trouble with this non-contradiction thing, because like there are cases when there are contradictions. Our position, which your position is probably the same as mine, is that is the metaphorical truth position that Brett Weinstein talks about. Like, religion is not literally true, but it's metaphorically true, and if you live your life as if it is literally true, it will be better for your well-being. So really, the way that the Christians get around not having a contradiction, is they say that religion is factually true. It's objectively true and also good for your well-being. This absolves the contradiction between, you know, well-being and truth being somewhat in opposition with one another. But you and I are in the contradictory position, are we not? Where we believe, well, sometimes well-being comes at the sacrifice of truth. Is that not a contradictory position?
First of all, let me have one remark first. I don't really subscribe to this metaphorical truth.
Okay.
Fine. I mean, I understand what Brett Weinstein means by it, and you know, that's one of the things. I really like Jordan Peterson in general, and his teachings and his video and his books. I've read both of his books. But like when he came to his debate with Sam Harris on truth, I just couldn't be on his side. I was like, I don't typically take Sam Harris's side on anything, but on that one, it was like, yeah, okay, So I believe in objective truth, and I think you can use the word truth in other, well, metaphorical, I guess, meanings, but I think it's very dangerous when you do this. Like metaphorical truth to me, it sounds to me like usefulness, right? I mean, so why not use the word useful as opposed to metaphorical truth? I think it's more confusing than anything, even though I know what he means, you know. So something is useful is not, to me, that's not the same thing as it being true.
Right.
Because first of all, usefulness in what context, and usefulness for how long? You know, something that's proven useful so far may turn out that it actually was a mistake, and then something else happened, the environment changes, the context changes, and what you thought was useful turned out to actually be useful only in that context. So I think you have to be a little careful. To me, truth is really a characteristic that you can only apply to speech, to propositions. So, when you say something, it's either true or false, and what that says is that the reference that you're making in your speech to something in the real world is actually that way or not. That's the correspondence theory of truth, which is not universally accepted, but it's the prevalent view of what truth means. So I don't like using the word truth for things that that have other words for it that already exist and I think are not as confusing.
Without getting dragged down into a debate over terminology, I respect the fact that the terminology you have a problem with, but there's a question here. Does objective truth always maximize human well-being? And there's two levels. There's the individual level and there's the society level. But I believe there are people in the world that will live better lives. They will have substantially better lives with a belief in God, which I don't believe in God. I think they're believing untrue things. So therefore, there's a contradiction there, because
I don't believe. I don't necessarily believe that always knowing objective truth is, well, ultimately, it depends on the context. Sometimes I think you're right. I think sometimes, but that is a feature that's derived from the fact that we humans have a limited availability to facts, there's a cost to obtaining information. So information is not free, So if you had unlimited information about everything all the time, then maybe you could make a case objective truth is actually always the best way to go. But because we don't have that availability all the time, and we have to make choices in context where we don't know all the facts and everything that's true, then we constantly use what's called heuristics to solve our problems in an expedient manner, because we don't have another choice, right?
Yes.
So I think in the abstract sense, objective truth would always be the best way to go. And that's, Jordan Peterson, one of his 12 rules for life, you speak the truth, or at least don't tell lies.
Yeah,
right?
But the second part is the interesting part. Because he gives himself an out, does he not?
Yeah, that's right. That's right. At least don't tell lies. So I agree with it. But I do think in practice, a lot of times we don't have access to objective truth, and we still have to live, right? We still have to act in the world knowing that we don't necessarily know everything about, well, we can't even do that. That's why, John Vervaeke's, I don't know if you follow Professor Vervaeke's lectures and all that much, but this thing about the meaning crisis and the relevance realization, how we pick out of the world what we think is irrelevant information is pretty fascinating subject in and of itself. But typically, we don't have unlimited information. We constantly have to use heuristics, which are shortcuts to act in the world. And in that sense, a lot of times things that are really not objectively true are still extremely useful. So I don't equate truth with usefulness, right? And that's partly why I don't like people using the word truth to express what I would call simply usefulness, And usefulness, ultimately, when you're talking about surviving in the world, is probably more what you need.
Yeah, more valuable.
More valuable, right? Exactly. But again, it's not because usefulness is fundamentally a greater value than truth. It's just because we don't have access to the entire truth, and we can't possibly have access to the entire truth at any time.
Yeah.
So we rely on usefulness and what has been proven useful so far, which again, you've pointed out mathematically, it is kind of a conservative philosophy, right? And you pointed out that what has survived has proven itself in a way to be useful. And so therefore, we ought to be pretty careful about just discarding it with no further thought. It doesn't mean that we can't change and innovate, but it does mean that we do have to be cautious about change. Like you mentioned, I think it's even worse than what you mentioned earlier. Change in general is going to be bad. Period. In evolutionary terms, no, it's true. I mean, in evolutionary terms,
yes.
For each mutation, for every time there is a mutation, there's probably 1,000 times. Don't quote me on the numbers, but it's probably 1,000 times more mutations that will kill. 10,000 times, a million. I have no idea. But the idea that it's far more likely. Let's put it this way: if we don't want to quantify this, but it's far more likely than any change is going to kill you than it's going to be beneficial for you, right? And in that way, nature is very wasteful. Like you got individual phenotypes that die all the time because they're not the best adjusted to the environment. And then you have entire species that disappear, from time to time. In fact, not from time to time. It's very common for species to just disappear for a failure to be the adapted or the most adapted at the time compared to other species. This is something that people, to me, like the hope and change, slogan of the Obama administration was I was like, well, I hope you'll realize change is not always good, right? I mean, it's like,
that's why you need the hope with it.
There was two things, hope to me. Hope is not a course of action, for one thing. It's not something you act on. I mean, it's like, well, it's great to be hopeful, but you should always kind of plan on the worst case. To just have that have a plan for worst case in your back pocket, because a lot of time the worst case means death, and you can't recover from that, right? That's like the end of the road. So, if you have a case where you lose something, but you're able to survive another day and maybe make up your losses, that's one thing. But if what you lose is your life, you're done. That's it. There's no more making up the lost ground. So in that case, you have to be very, very careful about what change brings. So that's something people don't tend to think about, that most of the time change. But we humans have an advantage, and you alluded to this earlier, that we don't have to necessarily die ourselves, our physical bodies, for our mistakes, because we can rationally put our ideas through the grinder and kind of critique our own ideas and see if they lead to contradictions. And then hopefully, I agree, it doesn't happen nearly as often as I'd like to see, but hopefully we can let our ideas die in our stead, right? We can let our ideas die instead of us dying for our mistakes. It's not easy, but no, it does happen. I mean, so that's why, to me, reason is so very important. Oh, by the way, and this brings us back a little bit to Jonathan Haidt, is you can't make a reasonable argument against reason. I mean, logically, it's not something you can do, right? You can't use reason to prove that reason is wrong.
Right.
That would obviously be a what's called a performative contradiction. You would be engaged in contradicting yourself simply by doing that, providing reasons for why a reason is not something we should use.
Jonathan Haidt is not critical of reason per se, and this is interesting because you brought up heuristics. And if we're having a conversation about the value of reason, obviously I feel reason is immensely valuable. The question is, are people at the individual level able to employ reason at the expense of intuition? And I think that you would probably agree that people lie on a spectrum where, I mean, yes, a lot of this folds into IQ, a lot of this folds into temperament. But there are certain people that are going to be it's going to be more necessary for them to focus on intuition. Certain people are never going to be able to function at a high
Oh,
level with reason. So therefore, nature gives us this backup
yeah,
system,
no,
which is
that's right.
completely intuitive. Jonathan Haidt is saying most people default to the intuitive system for all kinds of things. And in the moral sense, where we're talking, and a lot of people don't consciously reason this out, but morality, in a lot of sense, is about the future, and none of us know the future. So
Right,
we're
exactly. And that's a very good observation.
yeah, we're forced to use our intuition about what strategy is going to play out best. Like even when you get married, you're like, you're making a bet. Is this going to end in
Right,
divorce, or is this going to be a lifelong commitment? You don't
sure.
necessarily know. So you're forced to use like, there's no rational way that you can make that determination. You're forced to take a leap of faith, and that's in many ways accessing our intuitive systems.
Right. And I completely agree with Jonathan Haidt if when he says that in fact, I go farther than you. I think there is a spectrum, but I think most people by far, are intuitionists in that sense, that they'll go with their intuition and then, post hoc rationalize their decision, just like Haidt says. But I think I think I have a little bit of a difference here is that I think the few cases where people actually irrationally think about things have a disproportionate impact on society as a whole. Now that impact is seen through the work of philosophers or intellectuals throughout history. That and there's very, very few of them. If you look at the percentage of philosophers or great intellectuals that have contributed to our understanding of how society works and all that, it's an infinitely small proportion of the populace. But I think their impact is greater than their numbers because a lot of what we know is
just for a point of clarity, Karl.
Yes.
But you're saying the intuitive population is high. Like, I don't know. I'm thinking like
it's huge.
80%, 85%.
I think it's more like probably 99%.
Okay. So
let's not argue about the percentage.
It's funny. I have a reason for this, why I picked 85%, right. Because according to Haidt's numbers, about 15% of the population is libertarian. And I see those libertarians as being the most rational, like coolest, not intuitive people. Yeah. But unless you're talking about taxes, then the irrationality goes off the charts. So.
Yeah, I don't consider libertarians in general. I used to consider myself a libertarian, so I know where they're coming from.
Okay,
I used to when I was younger. When I was young, in my 20s, even maybe early 30s.
So, but you're saying
consider myself one.
But you said and the reason I jumped in was because you said that they have despite their numbers, they have a disproportionate hold on society, but their numbers are huge. So obviously, like, what do you? I don't necessarily.
No. I mean, the numbers. No. You misunderstood me. I mean, the numbers of intellectuals and philosophers and people, who do apply reason is tiny, but their impact, the impact of those people.
That makes sense.
No, of course, the impact of, not again. I don't want to call people irrational because I think deep down everybody wants to be thought of as rational.
Intuitive, I think, works because I don't see it as being offensive.
But I think it is true that most people, there's a saying I really love. It's an opinion should be the result of thought, not a substitute for it. And I think most people do tend to use opinions as a substitute for thought, in real life. Yes. I mean, they have their opinion, and they are entitled to it, which they are. I mean, there's no doubt about it. Nobody. Well, I mean, these days you wonder because, of course, I don't want to get into a debate about the radical left and their trend towards shutting down opinions now. So I guess the old thing about everybody's entitled to their opinion is no longer true, at least in those circles. But in general, I think most people still think, everybody's entitled to their opinion. But then again, opinions are cheap. That's my thing. So in general, when I talk to people and debate them, I tell them, I don't care what your opinion is. I really don't care. Now that sounds callous and, but what I do care though, is why you hold that opinion. I do care deeply about that. So if you just tell me that's your opinion, okay, fine. Everybody has one. But now if you can explain to me And a lot of time people can't explain that. This brings me to, something that's related to our talk here, is the fact that we culturally seem to know a lot of things that we can't explain. So there's a difference between implicit knowledge and explicit knowledge. So you're following me there, right? So let's say a child knows how to speak English at 5 years old or whatever it is, even earlier than that. But if you ask them to explain the rules of grammar they're following to speak English, they wouldn't know where to start. They had no idea, and yet they are using those rules pretty well. I mean, they might make the occasional mistake, but they are using rules that are implicit rules that they learned, because the human brain is made to learn language and to learn those rules, but they can't explain it. So in society, there are a lot of things like this that are culturally embodied. These are rules that are embodied in our culture. But that people, if you ask them, and Jonathan Haidt points this out, when he has these moral dilemmas or moral questions that he asks people, and they intuitively, they come out and say, yeah, I know this is wrong, but I can't explain why. I can't explain why I feel it's wrong. And that's very common, and it's normal, because a lot of the intuitions we have about moral values and a bunch of other things are actually things that we've picked up growing up. Right. I mean, like very young kids have very different moral intuitions than full-grown adults. Some of them are the same. They have the germs of the same intuitions they're going to have later, but they do have to be tutored in figuring out what's what. And so a lot of the rules, whether moral or other rules that we follow in life, are that type of thing for most people. Now, people like me are trying to tease out what is the rational basis for holding these rules, right? And there are advances in things like already mentioned. Game theory is a big one, but all kinds of other fields, and complexity theory is also another one that really interests me. And one of the guys that has been really great about applying complexity theory and complex system theory to practical aspects of the world is Nassim Taleb. So I don't know if you're familiar with his work.
Yeah, I've read a bunch of his books.
Yeah, right. I've read all his books from 15 plus years ago.
Yeah,
when he first came out with Fooled by Randomness.
The Black Swan is amazingly like The Righteous Mind. But Taleb, I love him to death, but he's not as good a writer as Jonathan Haidt. But ideas,
he's even worse a speaker.
The ideas in that book, the ideas in the book The Black Swan, which is pretty revolutionary, were all very similar to the ideas that Jonathan Haidt puts together in The Righteous Mind. They're just more poorly articulated.
Right. He's not as good a writer, and I don't know if you've ever heard him talk, but it's like the guy is, to me, is a genius. So his mind is always ahead of his mouth. So he's. And of course, part of it is, English is not his first language either. I mean, he's from Lebanon, and he speaks, I think, French and Arabic first, and then English, maybe as a third language. But anyway, but nevertheless, he's a fascinating character.
Can we dive into the intuitionism a bit, because what you're saying? I had some questions, and I'm super interested because you're basically making an argument for reason over intuition, but I see parallels between the two, and I want to point out one that you said you're very interested in. Why do people hold that opinion? And it's curious because the social intuitionist model that Jonathan Haidt puts forward gives a rational answer for why those people hold those opinions. Yes, they're holding them because socially they want to hold an opinion that raises their status within a certain community. That process is completely intuitive, but rationally we can deduce that, an increase in status is going to increase your reproductive advantages within a certain community. You're going to get certain perks. Like status is the ultimate currency in reproduction.
Yeah, from that point of view, that's true. It's rational in that sense. But let's say what I mean by the fact that rationality can help us really understand rules and moral rules in particular is that both in game theory and in systems control theory, that's something sometimes referred to as cybernetics, but that's the theory of how systems can control themselves internally and be self-sustaining. You have things like feedback loops, right? So I'm sure you've heard this, and I guess in popular culture, you can think of in terms of vicious circles versus virtuous yes. circles, right?
They're in that book. They're in that book.
So
Why Nations Fail. The one everyone's giving me a hard time about. Yeah, right. He goes in detail about virtuous circles.
Yeah, but even if you lower it to the less than the level of the nation state, in systems control theory, so you can have positive and negative feedback loops. So the typical archetype or example of the positive feedback loop is when you speak into a speaker that's too close, a microphone that's too close to the speakers, and then you get that squeal.
Yep.
It's an example of a positive feedback loop that's basically self-destructive. So you can't hear anything because now you get a super loud squeal because the microphone and the speakers have entered into a feedback loop that's positive. So the signal keeps reinforcing itself until it's so loud, basically you might even blow the speaker, if you're not careful. And then you have negative feedback loops, which tend to bring a system back to its equilibrium or steady state equilibrium state, right? So typically, that's why airplanes, for example, in aerodynamics are designed, well, until the advent of super fast computers are able to rectify this, but most traditional airplanes until the 1980s were always designed with a center of gravity that was in front of their center of lift, because what that meant is if there was turbulence in the air, that configuration would tend to naturally bring the airplane back into a stable configuration where the nose, any deviation in flight path would automatically try to stabilize itself to where it used to be. Whereas if you put the center of gravity behind the center of lift, you're going to have a wildly divergent system where even a small initial impact will tend to go like this, and then the airplane will destroy itself, right? So that's an example of the negative feedback loop, is where the airplane initially has turbulence, disturbs its flight path, but then it kind of oscillates back to its steady state, versus something that's divergent like this and causes catastrophic failure of the system. Well, you can apply that actually to a lot of things in society, and most people typically talk about, again, like Thomas Sowell is very big about talking about what incentives do to people's behavior, right? And really, when you think about it, that's exactly the same kind of thought, is that certain incentive will lead to virtual circles where a certain behavior will reinforce itself and propagate within the population, whereas some other behaviors, where you have the wrong incentives, lead to what typically people will call as unintended effects. I mean, unintended consequences is a very common term that I think most people are familiar with. What that means is that you have constructed something in society that's actually a negative feedback loop, as it just basically becomes uncontrollable and will lead to, if not catastrophic failure, to at least some pretty bad consequences.
Can you give an example?
Well, I don't want to get too political, but a lot of the welfare programs, and you can read Charles Murray and a bunch of other people that are, Thomas Sowell is obviously one of the people commenting on that. A lot of the incentives we've provided, this is not meant as a general criticism of the welfare state, let's put it that way, but it's a criticism of specific measures that we've taken within the welfare state that have actually made things far, far worse than than we would have wanted to.
Right.
So I'll give you a simple example. And again, people will, think maybe it's controversial. I don't think it's controversial, but we've inadvertently encouraged single motherhood or single parenthood, which actually in practice ends up being single motherhood most of the time.
I agree. I totally agree.
That was not the intent.
Totally.
But that's what we have ended up doing, and that's definitely an extremely vicious circle.
Yes.
I mean, we have entered this spiral of, that bad behavior engenders further bad behavior, which engenders, and for generations and generations, and that amazingly enough, some people, their solution to it is to actually provide more of the bad incentives that we've been providing in the first place. So that, to me, that means they don't understand the mechanism of negative feedback. They don't understand that problem in systems control theory.
How is this?
They're reacting emotionally, but if they were to study rationally things like what the theory is behind negative feedback loops and positive feedback loops, then their reason might give them an idea of why it is that we don't seem to be able to get out of these vicious circles, because we're using the wrong measures. And I think reason can show us that.
So let me lay out just on the welfare thing, because you had brought it up. So I think we agree that the incentives are all wrong. The problem, though, is that people vote for these welfare programs because they follow their moral intuition. Obviously they don't want to see the children of a single mother suffer. Yeah, exactly.
Yes.
But this, it seems like Jonathan Haidt's work is more useful in illuminating this, because even in his famous paper, he says, people following, and it's funny, it's not even Jonathan Haidt saying it, it's some other researcher before him that he's quoting, but he's saying, when people follow their moral intuitions, they can lead to institutions that are drastically wrong and bad for society, that we have to start with our moral intuitions and then empirically test them through, some sort of rational way. How do we get out of this mess? So what is the way around it? Obviously, we know the kinds of solutions. Once we're thinking of it rationally, we can come up with solutions, but they're not necessarily going to be implemented society-wide, because the people at the individual level, democracy is what it is, they're still going to be following their moral intuitions. And I don't have,
correct.
It seems like the argument most of the anti-theists are making is that if we magically pluck religion out of the equation, everyone's going to become this rational uber being.
No.
But so you and I,
not going to happen.
Yeah, so you're laughing.
Not going to happen.
Yeah, exactly.
Yes,
so
right.
We need to find a solution around this. And just us talking about this, people are going to intuitively think, this sanctimonious, big brain, centrist guys here trying to solve society's immediately they're going to target us as intellectual elitists. But I don't know how you necessarily have this conversation or fix the problem without having this conversation.
But ultimately, there is something that's very important that people have to understand, right? So if ultimately a reason cannot resolve the gap of understanding, then basically we're doomed, because people have different intuitions, and if they are not asked to provide, some kind of argument, some reasonable, at least, at a superficial level, right, as a minimum, then all we have to then we can only agree that we're going to fight each other until shots are fired or something, because reason is the only common language of humanity.
But listen, I have to push back, because one of the projects and one of the reasons why I think moral foundation theory and social intuitionism is so valuable is because the different intuitions that we have are not that numerous. Like, it feels like we can actually
6. He says 6 of them, but
they're actually working on a 7th, which I think is
all right,
missing. I think property rights. I think organisms are so territorial that there has to be some intuition towards property rights.
Oh.
But let me finish my thought here. So those intuitions, there's a perfect example. I can't remember what book it was in, but they were having difficulty getting semen to eat like fruit and they had to eat vegetables in order for them not to get scurvy. So their intuitions were, these vegetables are women's food, whatever their intuitions are, why, that's neither here nor there. But the way that they got around it was actually not saying rationally, you have to eat this stuff or you're going to die of scurvy. They appealed to their intuitions. And this is a lot of what Jonathan Haidt is saying, that we need to construct institutions that appeal to people's intuitions. And the thing that they did was actually brilliant. They started serving the vegetables only to the enlisted men. I don't know the terminology, but
the officers,
the high status individuals on the ship got the vegetables, and they were only for the high status people. And then there was nearly a mutiny. The people were like, "No, we got to have those." So that's how they rolled it out. And ultimately they were doing something that they never would have agreed to without this trick on their intuitions. Like, this food is for high status people. It's not for low status people. Therefore you can't have it. And how is that not appealing to these irrational intuitions that we have?
Right. Yeah. It's kind of a dilemma. I agree. Yeah. Because in this case, there are good reasons why they should eat that, right? I mean, deep down, right? We know from the medical, once they found out what causes scurvy, the lack of vitamin C. So there is the underlying reason. But you're right that to convince people, sometimes you have to do something else.
You have to trick them. You have to be,
yeah. Well, that's to me, that's kind of a dilemma. I mean, I don't disagree, but ultimately, though, even Jonathan Haidt, in his books, ultimately, he's trying to provide reasons why we should use intuition to reach people.
Yes.
So again, I definitely don't disagree with him, and I think he's done. Don't get me wrong. The criticism I have are pretty theoretical. In practice, he's done incredible amount of work to try to bridge the gap, between left and right and conservative, liberal, and all that stuff. So all praise for him for doing that. And his books are great. But it's just at the more fundamental level, I think, people are going to have like widely divergent. I mean, what intuition are you going to appeal to? I don't know, that's a tough one, because again, very controversial, but let's say abortion, it's, and again, I'm not saying that reason can easily solve this either, but there is such a divide on this that I think it's going to be very difficult to bridge that gap, other than ultimately by some kind of reasonable argument. And I'm not saying we do have that reasonable argument now, but absent that reasonable argument of some kind, maybe could be some kind of compromise, but it has to be something that both sides would agree as quote unquote reasonable. Because otherwise, right now, the divide is so great. I just don't see how an appeal to any intuition is going to even come close to resolving that and make people not fight each other over this. Anyway, you can. We don't have to answer that. We don't have to answer that right now. But
no, I think it's interesting. And since you brought it up, I mean, the abortion debate is very contentious for reasons. For very rational reasons.
See, we can't help saying for reasons, right?
Well, the people's interests diverge in anything reproductive. Obviously, men's interests diverge from women's interests in reproduction. Family members' interests diverge. There are people who want grandchildren. There are children of those people that don't necessarily want to have kids. Their interests could potentially be aligned against abortion, because the last thing they want to see is a grandchild lost. So, I mean, there are divergent interests in the world that I think people, they don't necessarily, like a woman or a man could never come out and say, listen, I don't want my child aborting a potential grandchild. So they have the intuition, though, that, hey, I want more grandchildren, but they could never say that. So they articulate other reasons. A lot of times those are religious reasons, but the real reason is a biological evolutionary reason. One of the reasons why I think Jonathan Haidt is so useful to both Christians and non-Christians alike is that we often substitute the best explanation for some phenomenon that we see regularly, and until we get a better narrative. And moral foundation theory and social intuitionism is just so much of a better narrative than the other side is crazy, that they're insane or
I
stupid
agree with
or
that.
irrational. Yes.
No, I completely agree with that. It's I guess it's more, it's a philosophical point that I'm making more than a practical. I think from a practical point of view, I think, I don't see much of another option that to go the Jonathan Haidt route and try to appeal to people's intuition about this. Because I do believe that I guess 90 or 99% of the people are not going to easily be swayed from the opinions they hold unless there's an appeal to their some other intuition that they have. And hopefully, though, see, that's the thing. Ultimately, what Haidt, I think, is doing is trying to appeal to the fact that people have different intuitions about different things. So he wants to get them to see that there is a contradiction between two or more of their fundamental intuitions. Mm-hmm. And the fact is that so at some point you kind of feel uncomfortable, or you start questioning, well, why do I feel this way, and at the same time I feel this way about something else, and the two don't seem very compatible, right? So to me, that's the start of a reflection that ideally would lead to some kind of reasoning about why it feels like there is a contradiction in your life. But most people, I would agree that most people in the end will just end up saying, well, I can't figure it out, so I'm going to stick with that intuition because I think it takes precedence over the other one. So anyway, that's, I don't have any issues with what you say. I thought from a purely logical point of view, and again, a logical argument is not going to appeal to people who don't care about logic. So I understand that. But what worries me, though, if we downgrade reason too much, is precisely this fact that, if we say it's all about the narrative, and for some reason people have very, very different narratives, what worries me that in the end, the outcome could be actual violence. That's what worries me a lot. Is that if we can't come to an understanding, if let's say Jonathan Haidt or other people are unsuccessful with their appeal to intuition, and people stick to their most fundamental beliefs for no reason, then we won't be able to talk to each other anymore. And when you have to solve the practical problems of living together in a society, then you can see that happening already. I mean, Antifa is kind of an expression of that. Mm-hmm. To them, they basically say, well, we can't make our point in a way that other people understand. So guess what? We're going to go out in the street and bash people's heads. I mean, thankfully, it's a very small, phenomenon right now. It hasn't escalated to where it's, people fear going in the street, but it's I don't know. It's a very uncomfortable feeling for me to see that things like that can happen in our society, and basically we kind of shrug our shoulders, and that's I don't know. I hope we can find a better way.
Well,
I guess is my bottom line.
What do you mean by downgrading reason? Because it seems like you have you're pretty comfortably in the same camp as me. Is that not many people are going to use reason, at least in their daily lives?
Yes, but what I mean is we should educate people. That's starting. It should be part of our culture. Now, it used to be more part of our culture. Mm-hmm. It used to be that, okay, we understand people are pretty irrational and bent towards their intuitions, but we at least made an effort to to make kids and young adults understand that at some point you have to be, quote unquote, reasonable, right? What does being reasonable mean? It means to at least pay some kind of lip service to reason.
Yes.
Even if it's only lip service, at least you don't completely disregard it. Our society now, in the past few decades, has really, I'll tell you what I mean by downgrading reason. I mean, even in popular culture, it's a very, very common trope these days to have, like in movies or novels, to have this thing that to find the truth, all you have to do is look inwardly, look into your heart. You know, use the force, Luke.
That's so bad.
I mean, now that's what it is. It's like, don't listen to other people, you know, they'll just mislead you. Don't listen to the philosophers. Don't listen. All you have to do to find, you know, your true self or the truth is look inwards. And oh, by the way, psychedelic drugs might help. You know, so.
Well, that part's true.
Yeah, well, okay, well, I wouldn't know, but you know, hearing some people say that. No, I do believe there is something to that.
But what you're talking about is totally is apt. They call it the autoethnography now, which is just basically you expounding upon your personal experience, and that somehow becomes data about the world. Which
exactly,
yeah, no,
and to me that's dangerous.
It is dangerous.
So it's not like people were ever completely. You know, obviously, nobody believes people were always rational, and you know, and most people don't care about reading philosophers, Plato. I mean, you know, they have no idea. But there was kind of like this tacit, implicit understanding that one ought to be reasonable, right? And that could get us into a discussion of, you know, ought versus is or whatever. But it's one of those oughts that can be derived from an is. You know, that I think it's a rational. It's a rationally true fact about the world that one ought to be reasonable. And even though people didn't end up doing, at least at some point, you know, when people were saying something, well, you're not being reasonable, they kind of understood what you meant, right? Even if they disagreed with you, but they understood what you meant. But now these days, it's like, no, it's all about either the narrative or either your, you know, your inner feelings, or now, you know, of course, you have this very recent that, you know, truth is to be found in your group, your ethnic group, or your gender, or your, you know, sexual orientation group. That's where truth is to be found, right? So that's yet another variant on an irrationalist view of the world. And so, you know, which one is correct? And unless you can, at the bottom, unless you can rest your arguments for and against group identity, you know, or you know, is the proletariat the real, you know, the real source of truth, and the evil capitalists are, you know, their narrative is wrong, but the proletariat is really where it resides, or whether it has to do with ethnicity or gender and all that. I think the only way to sort this out is by appeals. Ultimately, you have to appeal to some kind of reasonable argument, which means you have to appeal to reason at the bottom. You know. I'm not saying it's easy, but I don't see an out on this, because otherwise we're gonna continue on this path where having an intuition about something is ground enough to act on it, right? Mm-hmm. I feel this is the way it is, so therefore I'm entitled to using that opinion as my basis for acting in the world. I think ultimately that's pretty dangerous. But anyway, but from a practical point of view, I struggle with this, because I agree with you. I think, you know, people being what they are, without this, you know, and that's, of course, that would get us, you know, we have limited time. We can have another conversation, but it would get us into, you know, the usefulness or not usefulness of religion. And I think there is a lot of tie-in there as to what, you know, what is the purpose of religion in culture. I see religion as just another cultural artifact.
Yeah.
It's different in the sense that typically it's based on, the supernatural of some kind. But it's just part of culture. But anyway, so that would get us into another conversation. But that's my bottom line: is I don't see a way to wrest a common understanding other than ultimately an appeal to some kind of reasonable background that we can sort of all agree on. That people will find, even though they might find it reasonable for irrational reason, but we have to have a common language that people find as a reasonable basis for it to be a starting point for a conversation, right?
Yeah.
So does that make sense?
Yes. I'm wondering, have you watched the talk, The Rationalist Delusion by Jonathan Haidt? I'm wondering if that may be
Yes, I
influencing
have.
you. Yeah. I wonder if that triggered you a little bit. I wonder if that got.
Yeah, but it did a little bit. I mean, I understand what he means, but on the other hand, there are things that are rationally completely undeniable, and that gets us into a different branch of philosophy, or of actually logic, actually. Let's say you cannot rationally deny that you ought to be reasonable. I mean, you can't make a reasonable argument against reason. And I already mentioned that before, but that's an undeniable fact. Now, you can rant against reason. You can be, irrational about it and just deny it, just state as a fact, I don't believe in reason. But then don't start trying to give me a reasonable arguments as to why you don't believe in reason, because you're contradicting yourself right there. There are other things like this, and this has to do with the self-referential nature of human beings, right? We refer to ourselves so as a system that has a lot of implications. There are things that we can't deny about ourselves. Like, for example, the fact that we have to value things based on the fact that we have to act in the world. So the fact that you act in the world is undeniable rationally, because if you were to deny that fact, you just acted, because speech is another form of action. So denying that people have to act is self-contradictory, because you just acted to tell me that I can't act. And of course, people don't, that's not a big deal. But the big deal is acting always implies decision-making, because you have to rank order which action you're going to take next in your life. So you have several needs. And when you act, you have to basically come up with a ordinal ranking of what your priorities are. And that brings up the concept of value. What do you value most? You value a bunch of stuff, but what you value most right now is what you're going to act on right now.
Yeah.
These are all inescapable, rationally. You cannot rationally argue against these things. These are all based on the fact that we are humans and we reflect upon ourselves. And there are things that we must accept on a rational basis. If you don't accept them, then that's fine. But then we're going to end up basically, at some point, if we have a disagreement, we're going to end up fighting each other with actual, violence.
Yeah, we all want to avoid that.
Right, and we all want to avoid that, right? Yeah. So to me, there is a bottom line rational basis for human existence. It's something most people, of course, don't consider or don't understand. But in philosophical circles, those things are occasionally discussed. But so that's why, again, I make a difference between
argument, because this came up in my debate on objective morality, and they keep hammering like there's no rational argument for, or there's no way to determine that living, going on as a species is good. You can't, maybe it's not.
Well, that's
good.
True.
Yeah,
that's true. But then anybody who argues that in front of you and does not on the spot commit suicide, they don't. Well, I mean,
That's great.
Right. I mean, they don't believe what they say, right?
That's a great one. That's great.
Well, I mean, you either believe that life is better than death, or you believe that death is better than life.
Right.
But if you believe the second, well, go ahead. And to me, the fact that anybody that people can say a bunch of stuff, but
I would
the saying, actions speak louder than words, and
Karl,
just Jordan Peterson.
I would even argue that the guy who commits suicide still believes that life is better than death, and the reason that he's committing suicide is because his life sucks.
Yeah, well, in a way, yeah, you could argue that. But in any event, ultimately, to me, the source of all value, including moral value, ultimately is a choice between, do you prefer life or do you prefer death?
Yes. Yeah.
And if you prefer death, well, go ahead, just act on your belief, or else just don't give me a bunch of BS about, there can be no ultimate. I can see no more ultimate value than choosing between life and death. That's about as absolute as it can get.
But I think many people, they feel that philosophy is a bunch of BS because it paints you into these corners that are just like the normal person rebels at the idea that we're even having a conversation about whether life is good.
Yeah. But ultimately, say you can trace back all value. And actually who, and I'm not a huge fan, but I'm going to mention her name here because I think it's applicable within the context of this conversation. But some people would not consider her a philosopher in a strict term. She was not either. But Ayn Rand was a person who, in her novels and her philosophy, made a big deal out of this, that ultimately all value is a choice between life and death. And she tried to illustrate that in her works, right? In Atlas Shrugged. And again, I'm not saying this as a huge fan because I think there are some major issues with the way she saw things. But on the other hand, there are things that I can agree with. And one of the things was ultimately you can trace it back to a choice between. And of course, in practical life, it's way, way more complicated than this, right? Because in some cases, it's impossible to rationally trace back values to life and death in a very straightforward way. I mean, in some cases it's pretty straightforward, but in most cases, because we live in a very, very complex world, it becomes impossible. And that is why, by the way, we end up having to rely on culture to guide us. Yeah, the heuristics that our culture has built to try to help us navigate this complex world. And also partly on our intuitions, but that's because our intuitions have been molded by evolution, right? So of course, I know I'm preaching to the choir here. So
yeah, we should wind
the human brain.
We should wind this down. We've been going
for
almost an hour and a half, but it's just such a fascinating conversation.
I know we could go on, but I agree. We could pick that up some other time.
Well, I want to make one more point.
If you want.
I want to make one more point because you brought up Ayn Rand and the value, all value being limited to or reduced to life and death. I mean, that kind of came up in the debate that I was having yesterday, and I sat down and I actually
I need to catch up.
I actually wrote out the the moral interactions. People were giving me a hard time. Well, not really a hard time. I love my comment section. The people who follow my channel are the smartest people on YouTube. They're always educating me. So keep keep educating me down there in the comments. But they didn't understand my evolutionary argument for morality. And I kept saying, and this goes back to the Ayn Rand thing that you said, because it ultimately is a choice between life and death. But there are these situations, and one of the reasons why I'm critical of Ayn Rand is because she kind of has a philosophy of selfishness, which
that's a different story.
Yeah, doesn't work if you lay them out in the same way that I laid them out. And I have them in front of me. I'll just list them off.
All right.
But any interaction between you and another person has a moral component to it. If it's either a win-win situation, you win, they lose situation, you lose, they lose situation, or you lose and they win situation. Okay, so really it is life and death, but your death can come at the benefit of someone else's life, or there's a cost benefit arrangement that goes on there. And what I would say in my philosophy, this evolutionary look at morality, that we're all striving towards the win-win situation. You win, they win, society wins.
Right.
There are plenty of situations, and I even hierarchically ordered these, like Jordan Peterson
I remember
stuff.
you mentioning the book Non-Zero by
he goes
what's
into
his
this
name?
there.
That's what the book is about.
Yeah, so the second one, so the best case situation that everyone would want to go for is a win-win. You win, they win, right? The second best situation for you as an individual, and all this is from your point of view, obviously, would be you win, they lose, because at least you win, right? But the bit I ran into trouble in the third and fourth slot, because I'm like, this is difficult, because which is intuitively, like, which is better, for you to lose and them to lose, or for you to lose and them to win? And I was thinking from a personal individual perspective, I would think that it would seem more immoral for me to lose and them to win than for both of us to lose.
But see, the part of the problem is thinking in those terms is that, and Jordan Peterson talks about this. I've read many books before, even hearing it from him. But you can't think of win and win-lose and all that in terms of single games. So you have to think of it in most of life is about iterated games, right?
Yes.
You're going to repeat that game over and over again.
Yes.
And your strategy is going to be very different if it's a one-time deal, potentially, so your point is still valid, but your strategy is going to be different if it's a one-time versus an iterated game. Right?
Yes.
So
yes.
you have to keep that in mind. A lot of people keep forgetting that sometimes. Say, oh, well, morality can't be about this, because for me, the good thing would be to just take this person's stuff right now. If I'm stronger, it's a law of the jungle, so to speak. And because I'm stronger, I'm just going to take this person's stuff and his wife or whatever, and then I'm going to get away with it because there's nothing physically that they can do about it.
Yeah.
Well, that might be true in a one-time, non-iterated game, but over a long period of iterated games with many other different actors in the world, that's not a good strategy.
So Pragmatic Culture for $5 says, does Karl know about Ludwig von Mises and praxeology? If so, what does he think?
Yeah, I know they gathered that from the fact that I mentioned human action and all that. So yeah, that's where it came from. So yeah, I'm a big fan of Ludwig von Mises. Of course, he's known as an economist, but he was also in many ways a philosopher of sorts. But he's a person that's kind of revered in libertarian circles, especially because he was, of course, pro-free market and had a lot of argument. And he's potentially most famous, although, again, when I say that, most people have never heard of him, but he's the one that came up with an argument in economics that's pretty famous in that world, which is called the calculation argument against socialism. So most people, until he came along, thought of socialism is not going to work because it's let's say it's against human nature, right? It's got all these issues. But he was the first one to prove that actually, even if people were all angels and all wanting to cooperate, socialism would lead to disaster because you're completely unable to calculate how to use resources in an efficient way.
Yeah.
And it would take us way too far afield for me to explain to you why that is. I could do it maybe, given like half an hour, but we don't have the time. But he was the one that basically showed me that, well, it has, why socialism does not work goes way beyond the traditional, wrong incentives things and human nature. It goes against human nature. And if we just educated the people properly, then it would work. He actually showed that central planning just fundamentally cannot work from a purely logical point of view. Anyway.
Well, we should do another live stream on that because I'm always debating the socialists. So If you haven't seen any of my
Yeah,
debates,
obviously you can gather now. I'm not,
Yeah.
definitely not pro-socialist.
No, but you could give me some great arguments. I'm kind of.
Yeah.
It's funny. I enjoy doing the debates because I'm really learning so much along the way, and also I'm like honing my strategy. I'm one of those people that learns on my feet, and I feel like so many people are afraid to do things. I mean, you got to get your hands dirty, guys. I mean, if you want to
absolutely.
learn with your hands, learn with your feet, do it, and make it work. That's one of the reasons why I mentioned I'll throw another shill in here as we're closing down for my book. That's one of the reasons why I'm doing the book of my artwork first, because I've never done a crowdfunding campaign, and I figure, you know, even if it's just a total failure, I'll learn so much along the way. So it's really good to do something. A lot of times people are perfectionists and it holds them back. So get busy. Do you want to pitch your social media or anything before we go?
No, not really. I'm not a huge social media. I'm on Facebook, and that's about it. And I do comment on, say on YouTube quite a bit on very specific videos. But I tend to keep that more to myself. But if I'd be willing for people to email me, through you. So you've got my email. So if they want, I'm not going to mention it here on in the open. But if people are interested in getting in contact with me via email initially, and then we can figure out some other ways. But that would be probably the best initial way to contact me.
My email is on the screen. My email is on the screen, friended2157@gmail.com. You're welcome to email me anything, and I'll forward it to Karl. But we'll go ahead and leave it there.
Yeah, you can.
This was a fascinating discussion, Karl. I thank you for participating, and we'll have to do it again.
Nice, thank you. Yeah. Thank you for letting me speak on your channel, because you already have a pretty wide audience here, and it's these things interest me. And I knew we had a fair amount in common, but it would still be make for an interesting discussion, because we do have some nuances, I guess.
I have a tough position that's not like, there's no tribe that is articulating the position that I have. So I'm kind of forced to build my own tribe from the ground up, which one of the reasons why I latched on to Jordan Peterson was I realized, okay, Jordan Peterson is actually articulating the same message as me, but somehow he's getting, like, people are actually being receptive. So I'm doing something wrong. Maybe I should reformulate my message, but I'll go ahead and leave it there. I have another fire video that's going to be coming out sometime this week. I'm working on wrapping up now. It is amazing. You guys are going to want to see it. I think it might be my first 20 million view video, because this thing, I had a fire video that went almost to 10 million views, and this thing is 10 times better, easily 10 times better. So I'll go ahead and leave it there. Thanks for joining in. Thanks for this super chat, Pragmatic Culture. Take care, everyone, and we'll see you in the next video.
See you next time.